Hey there, everybody. This is Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and this is the very first in this new series that I'm experimenting. So if this is the first and last one, that's a possibility. I'm hoping to do more on drinking in the Parashah. Now, we're starting off top of the new year with Parashah Bereshit. And if you'll notice, there's actually nothing explicit about drinking in this week's Torah portion. Now, there is, however, a really fascinating rabbinic midrash, a narrative expansion that takes place in this week's Torah portion about what was the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, there's a really fascinating rabbinic text that actually appears twice in the Babylonian Talmud. We have 3 second-century rabbis arguing different positions as to what fruit they believe what tree that could have been. So one is, right off the bat, is Rabbi Meir, and he says it's grapes, because grapes are the only thing that bring crying and wailing into the world. Really interesting. Then we have Rabbi Yehuda, who argues that it was wheat. It's a strange assertion because it was a tree with fruits, and everybody knows wheat is not a tree, and it doesn't necessarily give off fruits. I'll get back to that in a moment. And then finally we have Rabbi Nehemiah, who argues that it was a fig. That it was a fig tree, that they were eating figs. Really interesting assertions. I'm going to actually work my way back. Actually, I'm going to start off with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, it's a really strange position to be arguing. And in fact, the rabbis of the Talmud were also not happy with his argument. It was really not persuasive, but he did offer a really fascinating argument to justify his assertion, which was that a child only knows how to say mommy and daddy when they're able to eat wheat, which is really interesting. If this is the tree of knowing good and bad, right, there's a certain sense of knowledge and speaking ability that comes along with it. So it's a really interesting assertion. We also have Rabbi Nehemiah. I mentioned he said fig, and he argues that the reason is because you fix something that you messed up. The way that you mess up, you also fix with that same thing. So because we then later see, like after Adam and Eve eat the fruit, they then affix for themselves little coverings made of fig leaves. Well, if fig leaves were right around, wouldn't it make sense? Wouldn't it be logical to argue, as Rabbi Nehemiah does, that they ate from the fig tree, they realize, and then they grab the leaves of the tree and then cover themselves up? I personally like that the most. But none of those involve drinking. Rabbi Meir's assertion, however, does. Now, when he talks about grapes bringing crying and wailing into the world, he really doesn't necessarily mean grapes. He actually means this. He means wine. Now, it's really fascinating because you could take it in a couple different directions. One is like Rashi, who argues that, and both of the places this text appears in the Talmud, that it's because bad things happen when people get drunk. That can happen. We can see that even in the Tanakh, right? Right there in the Bible, people get drunk and some bad stuff can happen. We see that in real life. That's true. But another thing that can happen with wine is, and I think this would actually be a really fascinating possibility for what Rabbi Meir is asserting, although I don't necessarily think that he meant this, is that sometimes when we encounter new knowledge, new information, especially when it concerns morality, right? Good and evil, good and bad, that sometimes it can be shocking to us and we wail or we cry for the way that things have been and things that we may have done. I think that's a really fascinating way of taking his assertion about bringing wailing upon the world. I don't necessarily think that that's what he meant. He definitely did not mean grapes, okay? He clearly meant wine, and that's why this is a drinking text, and that's what it has to do with this week's Parsha. I will throw in one other thing. We also find a similar discussion in Bereshit Rabbah and Midrash Rabbah, also a whole chunk of narrative expansions, and another possibility that they offer up is an esrog. That's right, an esrog. I'm not getting into that because that's not the text that we have in front of us in the Babylonian Talmud, but I just want to mention that an esrog is another possibility that later rabbis discussed as a possibility for the fruit of the tree of good and knowledge. So, wrapping up, Rabbi Meir suggests grapes and really wine, as well as Rabbi Yehuda offering wheat and Rabbi Nehemiah talking about figs. So, with that, I want to wish everybody l'chaim and Shabbat Shalom.